Hey guys, I'm Ted here to give you another lecture, and for this lecture we will continue where we last left off. We were discussing African Americans after Reconstruction. We ended speaking on the Exodusters and their attempts under Pap Singleton to forge better life for themselves in the Kansas, Nebraska, and Oklahoma territories. Unfortunately, have to discuss at the end of that lecture racial discrimination in milling operations and also on the railroads brought an end to that, along with the intermittent droughts at the end of the 19th and beginning of the early 20th century. We also discussed the rise of African American cowboys in the West. We spoke of such entertaining and larger-than-life figures like Deadwood Dick, who was just words really can't describe a character like that. We also discussed the Bonga family of Minnesota and all of their contributions to American history and in particular to the history of Minnesota. All right, but to dive right into our lecture, we'll discuss the New South, as it was called, the New South that was championed by Redeemers, who promised to modernize and industrialize the region. This New South, it would turn out, was to be based on racial discrimination, and it was confronted with declining cotton prices. Now, the Redeemer government carried on the Reconstruction government's policy of internal improvements, and Henry Grady, Grady rose to become a leading figure of the post-Reconstruction Southern states. He achieved widespread fame by giving a much-admired speech on how to modernize the Southern states, highlighting that the breakup of the Great Plantations and the creation of hundreds of yeoman farmers really brought the South closer into line with Jefferson's agrarian republic. Now, Grady's speech also called on increasing industrial capacity to better compete. Industry prospered. Had the Duke family grew to dominate the tobacco industry with their American Tobacco Company. Birmingham became a major center of steel production. Birmingham really became known as the Pittsburgh of the South for the incredible amount of steel that were produced and exported. West Virginia and Kentucky became coal mining centers, and of course North Carolina became a forestry industry center, producing exporting large amounts of lumber, while also in particular the Piedmont region of North Carolina, that area that sort of abuts, that sort of began to slide into the Rocky Mountains. That area had long been a textile center, but it really began to surpass New England. Has had the nation's leading textile manufacturing center. And throughout all this, the New South was notorious for racial discrimination, for racial prejudice, and also for child labor practices. The child labor practices of the New South were quite notorious, to say the least. Now, while the Exodusters, who we discussed in our last lecture, while they were heading west, the Redeemers were reaping the benefits of the election deal with President Hayes, who brought Reconstruction to an end and removed federal garrisons from the region. The effects of Reconstruction lingered until the end of the century. While racial segregation was on the rise, it had not yet become widespread or complete. In the late 1870s, late 1880s, African Americans continued they continue to exercise the right to vote. A number of communities continue to exercise the right to vote and to elect African Americans to public office. In South Carolina and Mississippi, this was especially true. Both states had enormous African American populations and continued to elect African Americans to Congress until the end of the 20th century. Even with the continued ability to vote, there were significant differences and hardships confronting African Americans in the redeemed states. Early redemption it's characterized with the fact that during Reconstruction, African Americans voted and elected a number of persons from their communities to local and state offices. While they still voted, after redemption, their votes were limited and controlled. During Reconstruction, they formed partnerships with free state migrants and local sympathizers, whom redeemers tended to term carpetbaggers and scalawags. These three groups formed the base of the Southeastern Republican Party. After redemption, the Republican Party all but disappeared from the Southeast, along with the free state migrants and the local sympathizers, leaving African Americans to the mercy of the former slavocrats and ex-Confederates, who comprised the new redemption elite. With the collapse of the Republican Party, the Southeast became a one-party region. That party, the 19th century Democratic Party, was firmly devoted to the principles of white supremacy. Now, throughout the region, there were sharp divisions. Now, even though the region was under one-party rule, there were still sharp divisions within the Redeemer support base. It was not long after redemption that the old anger and resentment that flared occasionally before the Civil War reappeared again. Many poor Redeemers, especially those who had been pushed into the hilly upland regions by the slavocrats, and the small farmers who had suffered huge losses during the war, began to come to the view that the United States Civil War had been a rich man's fight, but a poor man's fight. The economic worries of the 1880s, as cotton prices continued to fall, led many small farmers deeper and deeper into debt to local merchants who fronted seeds and provisions against the upcoming crop. Now, as prices fell, many farmers found themselves unable to pay their debts and were forced to sell their lands. Now, this resulted in the massive increase in the amount of sharecroppers. As the economic worries grew, poor Redeemers elected their own members to senior positions in the local Democratic Party. This group eventually came to split with the Democratic Party and to form a new group, the Southern Alliance. Now, this popular movement sought to address the raising debt and falling crop prices. Now, African American farmers and sharecroppers followed suit and formed the Colored Farmers Alliance. Now, these organizations grew astronomically by the late 1880s, and they counted nearly 3 million members between them. Beginning in the 1880s and the 1890s, Southern governments began disenfranchising African American voters. The 15th Amendment prohibits depriving voting rights on racial grounds. Now, Redeemers went ahead using intimidation tactics that have been successful during the 1860s and early 1870s to discourage African American voters. But it wasn't until 1898 that they began to take a more broad and a more permanent step towards disenfranchising African American voters once again. Louisiana introduced what was then called the Grandfather Clause. Now, the Grandfather Clause deprived African Americans whose grandfathers had not voted before 1860 of the right to vote. The Grandfather Clause was really designed to target the freedmen, former slaves. Slaves were the only ones who really weren't able to vote prior to 1860. The Grandfather Clause cut the African American vote in Louisiana from 130,000 to 53,000 by 1900. Now, the Grandfather Clause was effective to reduce African American voter turnout, but not to fully disenfranchise the entire African American community. So the Redeemers turned to the poll tax and to literacy tests to complete disenfranchisement. Illiteracy was widespread amongst the Southern population, but the literacy tests were only enforced against African Americans. Understanding clauses were included to allow illiterate European Americans to vote, but the poll tax, which was a sum of money that had to be paid before a voter was allowed to vote. And in many occasions, the poll tax had to be paid some months in advance of an election. Now, since most African Americans were stuck in debt peonage as sharecropping farmers, they could not afford to pay the tax. Now, poor European Americans would often have wealthy neighbors or community leaders pay the tax for them. It was also not uncommon to find that in exclusive European American communities, the poll tax was never even taken. Disenfranchisement thus mainly only affected African Americans, and it was an uneven process. It went faster in some areas and slower in others. For example, for instance, there were still African American voters in the state legislatures of Georgia and South Carolina until 1900 and 1908, respectively. Now, this rollback of civil rights in the redeemed states was accompanied by silent acquiescence by a bevy. It was accompanied by silent acquiescence from the former free states, from northern, northeastern, Great Lakes, Midwest, and of course West Coast and Southwest states. Everybody simply acquiesced to what they were doing. Nobody confronted them on it. Nobody called them out on it. They allowed it to happen. And the Supreme Court basically in a series of rulings undid all of the legal gains made during segregation. In 1883, the United States Supreme Court ruled in a series of 5 cases, collectively known as the civil rights cases. The most impactful of these was the overturning of the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which largely invalidated the equal protection portions of the 14th Amendment in regard to private citizens. Now, this court ruled that Congress did not have the authority to legislate on the private actions of individuals, only on the practices of the states, making it perfectly legal for businesses to deny employment opportunities or services to African Americans. All of these decisions, of course, paled in comparison to the Supreme Court's ruling in the Plessy v. Ferguson case of 1896, which formally legalized racial segregation. This decision allowed not only private businesses, but also state and local office holders to introduce elements of segregation as long as the facilities were equal. Now, this period saw racial separation as nearly uniform. The Southern Alliance leadership and individual farmers were quick to realize that sharecroppers and poor farmers had much in common, regardless of whether they were African American or European American. They realized that they had much in common with each other, and they noted that they had virtually nothing in common with the former slavocrats and the local Democratic Party elites. As Tom Watson of Georgia remarked, the accident of color can make no difference in the interests of farmers, croppers, and laborers. You are kept apart that you may be separately fleeced of your earnings. And by 1890s, both groups were edging closer and closer to the People's or the Populist Party, which nearly toppled the two-party system. The Populist Movement called for immediate redress to the concerns of farmers, namely the nationalization of the railways, government purchase of crops, and an inflationary monetary policy that would lower the value of money and raise the price of crops, allowing the farmers to repay their debts. Now, the Populist Party was strongest in the Southeast and the Midwest, where there were the most farmers. Now, the Populists eventually fizzled out nationally after 1896. and that was a sad affair for the African Americans in the Southeast. Had the Democratic Party were keen to take advantage of this. They made very open and very racist appeals to the poor redeemers. They made frequent allusion to racial mixing. The redeemer elites were able to recapture their audience. They also paraded white women at political rallies who called on the men in attendance to protect them from African American males. They also stuffed the ballot and won by large majorities areas with very large African American populations. Rampant political corruption in the Deep South, in the redeemed states. Now, Jim Crow. Jim Crow rose in the 1880s. It went hand in hand with the end of Reconstruction. American segregation is popularly known as Jim Crow, and Jim Crow was once an unspoken custom in the former slave states. It was really just a continuation of the old slave codes, black codes, but they were now becoming established by law. These new laws either divided the public spaces by race and ethnicity, or prohibited African Americans totally. At the same time, new voter disenfranchisement laws were coming into place. The aforementioned poll tax and grandfather clause and literacy test. All of these were coming into place. Were coming into place. The two most prominent, had I noticed, were the poll and the literacy test. These two laws effectively nullified the population edge that African Americans had in many parts of the Southeast. In areas where such laws were ineffective, the Redeemer passed the grandfather clause. And as stated earlier, the total effect of the grandfather clause was to disenfranchise anyone whose grandfather had been a slave. Now, Jim Crow, it was legally enforced racially segregation. Segregation was instituted for purely racist motives. One of which, and this was the most pertinent fear of the generation that instituted Jim Crow. The fear was that African Americans born after slavery, that is, African American born after 1865, would not be as pliant as those who had been born in and had known slavery. And thus they would not be inclined to show any social deference in the future. A very racist, a very pale motivation for instituting this policy. But we'll break here, and we will come back to wrap up African Americans after Reconstruction. As always, hit like, subscribe, and comment, and let me know what you thought about this lecture. As always, I'm Ted, and I will see you guys next time.